Hello, everybody. Welcome to our lecture for Chapter 1. I'm Dr. Wells, and to remind you, I wanted to let you know you can reach me by email, which is right here for you. This email is also posted in our syllabus if you need to find it there for any reason. If you have any questions for me, I can be available by appointment if you would like to do a Google Hangout meeting. I'm also available by appointment using the chat feature in Canvas if you prefer to ask simple questions that way. We can chat back and forth if we designate a certain time. And of course, if you have questions, you can also just send them to me via email. That's fine as well. I'm happy to respond to you as quickly as I can. Okay. So today we're going to get started talking about ecology and really focusing on what it is in Chapter 1, what ecology is. One of the main ideas behind ecology is this idea that everything in life is connected. And that's really what we mean by the web of life. Just like a spider web that connects a bunch of strands, all living and non-living things are connected in the environment. And for example, living organisms are called biotic organisms, whereas abiotic features would be non-living. And so in this picture, we have a lot of living organisms. We have flowers and we have insects, and we also have some non-living components like the atmosphere, temperature, soil conditions, conditions in the ocean. Okay? And so that's a broad realm of what ecologists very often study. A good definition of ecology from your textbook is that ecology is the scientific study of the abundance and distribution of organisms in relation to other organisms and environmental conditions. Notice that the definition includes both biotic and abiotic features. A slightly simpler way to kind of say the same thing would be to say that ecology, it involves the interaction of organisms with each other and the environment. That's also a definition provided by your textbook in Chapter 1. And even though organisms do not necessarily always interact directly with each other, I wanted to discuss and mention that even though they may not seemingly interact, they may actually be connected through the environment. And this is something else that ecologists study, these seemingly unconnected interactions. One example is provided for you right here. You can see I've given you a picture of some wolves and a river. This is from Yellowstone National Park. And we're going to talk later in the semester about how the reintroduction of wolves drove herbivores in the park from grazing out in the open to being more discreet and hiding in the forest more, which allowed those grasslands to grow up and vegetation to grow much more than it would have, and the entire Yellowstone ecosystem changed over a short period of time, including the flow and depth of rivers and a bunch of things about river vegetation, and even animals returned to the river that hadn't been there before. So that would be seemingly unconnected. Your book goes over 8 ecological maxims, which are these kind of rules that it gives in ecology. These are things that apply kind of broadly to ecology. So I thought we could briefly go through them. Number 1, we've been talking about already. And this is kind of like what you may know of as the butterfly effect. You could never do just one thing. Organisms interact so tightly that one thing affects everything else downstream from it. Okay, so there's never just one thing. Everything's interconnected. Number 2, there is no away. Everything goes somewhere. So everything really, instead of disappearing, it really just cycles to another place, another form, and it's really important that ecologists think about this, and this is something that ecologists study as well. A simple example, just to give you something to visualize, excess nutrients may be dumped into a stream or a river, and where it might disappear from that riverbank right there, it could end up potentially in an estuary or even an ocean downstream. Number 3, populations cannot increase in size forever. Ecologists study population, a number of characteristics about populations, and populations are finite. They're going to be limited by things like food, space, things that they compete for, that they each need, and those resources are finite, and that is going to determine the size of a population, how finite resources are. Number 4, there is no free lunch. If an organism uses its energy for one thing, like in this example, reproduction, that's something organisms are trying to do, there has to be a trade-off in energy where energy is limited from some other function. And in this example, it's growth. So the trade-off would be, for example, so this might be familiar to some of you, if you're a large mammal, you tend to have fewer young than a small mammal might have. Okay, and that's an example of allocating more energy to growth than to reproduction. You can't have both. There has to be a trade-off. All right, evolution matters. Of course it does. A universal feature of living systems is that they evolve or adapt over time, and that is evolution. Evolution can be defined as a change in the genetic characteristics of a population over time, or it can be described as, Darwin described it as descent with modification. Which would be the process by which organisms gradually accumulate differences from common ancestors. Okay, so that's what evolution is, and it's very tightly related to ecology. Ecological variation often drives evolution in species. Number 6, time matters. In ecology, time is studied by measuring something called succession. Succession is the change in the species in a community or the development of an ecosystem over time. So ecologists study things, variation over time. They also study how things vary over space. So ecologists study variation in space to understand very often why certain communities or ecosystems exist. Okay? And finally, number 8, this is very similar to number 1. Life is impossible without species interactions. Life is interdependent on the interaction of species with each other and their environment. So, in a nutshell, ecology focuses on biotic and abiotic interactions. Hopefully, that was reflected in that portion of the lecture. Ecology focuses on how organisms affect and are affected by other organisms and their environment. And humans are not separate from this. Humans um, are not apart from ecological interactions. In fact, we have an enormous impact on them. And you can think of the domino effect. When people alter one aspect of the environment, it often causes downstream changes that we either don't intend or anticipate, or we don't weigh as being important. So that's something to think about too. A lot of ecologists study the human interaction with the environment. So these are just a few ways that humans can influence ecological systems. We talk about these processes much more in conservation biology, which is biology 4244. So humans emit pollution everywhere they build roads, power lines, buildings, any infrastructure. There's chemical pollution, um, but there's also just environmental pollution associated with infrastructure. Habitat destruction is actually the number one threat to biodiversity loss right now. So the loss of rainforests and the loss of grasslands are very detrimental right now to species loss. Climate change, we're going to talk about this semester, but one effect that humans are having from fossil fuel combustion is the emission of a lot of greenhouse gases, which are subsequently melting Antarctic ice at unprecedented rates. And as that happens, sea level is rising, and we're losing a lot of Arctic species. And then also overharvesting. Depleting fishery stocks is a very good example of one way that humans are just kind of taking and taking and taking from the environment without really thinking of being sustainable in that manner. Okay, so humans cannot be studied separately from the things that we study in ecology. They have to be taken into account. So because biologists study things from very large to very small, I thought it would be useful to walk through a few different approaches that ecologists take before looking at a few different types of things that ecologists study. So ecology, again, it goes from studying small things to very big things. So the individual or organismal approach, this seeks to understand how adaptations or characteristics of an individual's morphology, physiology, or behavior enable it to survive in an environment. So if you've watched the video that was assigned along with this lecture, I believe that they talk about in crocodiles, it might be. I can't remember. As you know, if you're an ecologist, you might study an individual species and study its adaptations, morphology, physiology, etc. If you study populations, you study groups of species. And specifically, population ecologists examine variation in the number, density, and overall composition of individuals over space and time in that population. If you are a community ecologist, then you seek to understand the diversity and interactions of organisms, different types of species living together in the same place. So you might study interactions in the rainforest between diverse species that live in the same place at the same time. If you are an ecosystem ecologist, then you examine the interrelationships between living organisms, physical features, biochemical processes, natural phenomena, and human activities in ecological communities. So that's a very broad definition. What it means is that you are including non-living cycles, processes, or phenomena along with community ecology that you're studying. You're also considering the abiotic features when you're an ecosystem ecologist. Okay, so knowing this, you can imagine that ecological studies are very broad in scale. And just to give you an example, if you were an organismal ecologist, you might literally study molecules. This is DNA, but you may study the types of proteins that are similar between species or populations. You might study change DNA in populations. So you can study very, very small things like molecules, but a community ecologist might use a greenhouse, for example. May not. It could be something outdoors, but to examine community interactions in a very controlled environment. And this is up here as an example of a landscape experiment, which I'm partial to. This is I did my master's research in this field system. This is a landscapes system that looked at how corridors, which are connecting habitat patches in this landscape experiment, they looked at how corridors influenced the distribution of different species throughout this forest, which is a longleaf pine forest. So that would be an example of a community study, actually, that was outside, but at a much bigger scale than something like a greenhouse. So one thing that ecology is not is environmental activism. It's a real science, and ecologists follow the scientific method, and they follow the scientific method whether they're working with DNA or forest fragments. So I wanted to just review that with you. Step one, you make an observation and you develop a clear question or several questions from that observation. So I'm going to give you an example that has nothing to do with ecology. I'm going to say, I get in my car, and my observation is when I turn the key, the car doesn't start. My question might be, why won't my car start? Okay. Number two, use prior knowledge to develop potential answers to the questions. A potential answer to a well-framed question is called a hypothesis. So step two is form a hypothesis. In our car example, the hypothesis might be, I'm out of gas. That would be something that, based on my knowledge of cars, would be a reasonable potential answer to the question, why won't my car start? Because it is out of gas. Okay? So my hypothesis would be, my car is out of gas. Step three is to perform a controlled experiment to evaluate competing hypotheses. Now, other hypotheses that we may have tested other than the gas hypothesis would be, maybe there was something wrong with the starter. Maybe the battery was dead. And what we would do is we would test each of these things individually to evaluate our competing hypotheses. And in our example, the experiment would simply be filling up the car with gas to see if that, changed anything. Step 4 of the scientific method, draw conclusions from your experiment about which hypothesis to accept and which to refute based on your data. So if your car starts immediately after putting in some gas, then you can accept your hypothesis and move on with your day and drive your car. All right? All right, so that's an introduction to Chapter 1. I would like to encourage everybody to go ahead and, in addition to reading Chapter 1, please go ahead and read Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. This class will move very quickly, even though it is online. And there are online data activities for you to do for Chapter 2, which is due on the 22nd of May, and Chapter 3, which is due on the 25th of May. So make sure you complete those data activities early. So if you have any questions, you're able to communicate those with me. And as always, our mantra, wash your hands. Hope everybody is doing well, and thanks for listening. See you back here again for Chapter 2.